The morning air of Paris once carried the perfume of roses. On one August dawn in 1572, it carried only the scent of blood. Bodies floated on the Seine like torn garments. The bells of every church tolled not for prayer, but for massacre. In the silence that followed, the people did not whisper the name of God. They whispered hers, Caterina de Medici, widow in black, mother of kings, the woman they called a witch. She had been born a child of Florence, promised to fortune, orphaned before she could even know the comfort of her parents. She was hidden in convent walls where she listened to the shouts of soldiers outside the gates. From those shadows, she learned to survive. Years later, she entered the French court, not as a queen beloved, but as a bride betrayed. Her husband already lost to another woman. Yet she endured. She gave France heirs. She watched 3 sons wear crowns that weighed heavier than their fragile minds. Her life was a theater of whispers. They said her perfumes masked poison. They said her jewels carried hidden daggers. They said her astrologers read death in the stars, and that her golden ring could kill with a single touch. Truth and rumor mixed until her very breath was feared. She became the Black Queen, a figure of survival and suspicion, a woman whose silence seemed louder than 1,000 proclamations. This is not a tale of saints. It is the story of a girl who became an orphan, a bride who became a widow, and a mother who became the shadow of France itself. Watch until the last moment of this film, and you will see how darkness grows inside a crown. And if you wish to keep walking through the hidden corridors of history, where every throne is stained, subscribe now. Caterina de Medici was born in Florence in 1519, a child destined for greatness, yet abandoned by fate before she could even open her eyes to the world. Her father was Lorenzo II de Medici, Duke of Urbino, the heir of one of the most powerful families in Italy. Her mother was Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, a French noblewoman with royal blood of her own. Within weeks, both were dead. Her father taken by disease and her mother following him to the grave only days after giving birth. The infant Catherine, wrapped in silks yet surrounded by mourning, began life not as a cherished daughter, but as an orphan whose name carried more weight than her fragile body. The streets of Florence at that time were no place for innocence. The Medici were both rulers and targets. Rival factions clamored for their downfall, and the child became a pawn in games she could not yet understand. Still, even as a baby, she was a symbol of a dynasty. The enemies of her family knew that her very existence meant the Medici line could continue. She was watched, guarded, and sometimes hunted. When rebellion broke out, Catherine was hidden in convents across the city. Imagine the walls of stone echoing with chants of nuns, while outside soldiers roared her family's name in hatred. She was still small enough to be cradled by sisters in habits, yet old enough to feel the fear when gates shook under the fists of armed men. These convents were meant to protect her, but to Catherine they became schools of survival. She learned silence as a shield, patience as a weapon, and endurance as her only companion. As she grew, she came to understand the shadow over her life. She was the last hope of her father's branch of the Medici, and every rival family knew it. Her survival became both a miracle and a curse. The girl who should have been playing in gardens instead whispered to shadows on chapel walls, making them her confidants when no one else could be trusted. Fortune turned when her cousin, Cardinal Giulio de Medici, became Pope Clement VII. He saw in Catherine not just a child, but a bridge between Italy and France. She was taken from Florence to Rome, and the girl who had once been a prisoner in convents was now prepared for a destiny far greater than herself. Under the gaze of the papal court, She studied etiquette, languages, and the intricate dances of diplomacy. Yet beneath the velvet gowns still lived the child who had learned to watch rather than speak, who had survived by trusting no promise and fearing every silence. By her teenage years, the Pope had already woven her into his plans. A marriage was arranged with Henri, the second son of France. To outsiders, this was triumph, a Florentine girl bound to one of Europe's greatest thrones. To Catherine, it was another cage, a new court where she would be tested not by soldiers at the gate, but by whispers in the ballroom. The orphan of Florence was about to become a bride of France. She carried with her not just jewels, but the memory of loss, the chill of convent stone, the fear of angry crowds, and the iron will to survive them all. What awaited her was not love but betrayal. And in that betrayal, the seeds of her transformation into the Black Queen would be sown. The bells of Marseille rang out in 1533, calling nobles and clergy to witness the union of a Medici girl and a French prince. Catherine was only 14, her figure fragile, her face still carrying the softness of youth. Yet her name had already been whispered across Europe as the Pope's chosen bride. Henri d'Orléans, the second son of King Francis, stood beside her at the altar. To the crowd, it was a triumph. The fortune of the Medici tied to the crown of France, a girl who had known the silence of convent walls raised to royalty. The truth was colder. Henri held her hand without tenderness. His gaze strayed, searching for another face in the throng. Diane de Poitiers, the woman who had already claimed his devotion, stood radiant, though she was twice Catherine's age. The feast that followed glittered with light and song. Yet when the candles burned low, Catherine walked alone into her chamber. Henri had vanished into the arms of Diane. Her bridal bed was draped in silk, yet empty of love. The humiliation was complete. The court began to whisper. They pitied the little Florentine whose crown was made of thorns. When months passed without a child, the whispers sharpened. They said she was barren. They said she was cursed. Each morning she painted her face with calm. Each night she prayed in silence. And still her place in France trembled like a candle in the wind. One afternoon, as she entered a gallery, Catherine found Diane waiting. The mistress bowed her head with a smile that cut deeper than any insult. Diane's voice was soft, but the venom was clear. "You wear the crown, Madame, yet it is I who hold his heart." Catherine steadied her breath. Her eyes did not blink. She answered in a whisper that trembled but did not break. "Then keep his heart. I will give him a dynasty." The words fell like stones into water, echoing through the years to come. In that moment, Catherine knew her power. Love had been denied to her, yet she could command bloodlines. Diane could bask in Henri's affection, but only Catherine could bear his heirs. Time proved her right. At last she conceived, then another, and another, until 10 children carried the Valois name. Each cradle was her fortress, each child her shield. She endured Diane's jewels, her place at Henri's side, the cruel laughter of courtiers. Yet Catherine's power grew with every birth. When Francis III died and Henri was crowned king, Catherine stood as Queen of France. The coronation glittered. But even on that day, Diane paraded in splendor, wearing pearls that should have belonged to the queen. Catherine bowed her head and endured. She had learned long ago that survival demanded patience, and patience would one day make her stronger than either Henri or his mistress. The bride betrayed had become the queen overshadowed. Her crown was real, but her humiliation was deeper still. What the court could not see was that behind her silence she was storing every wound like arrows hidden in a quiver. When fate struck Henri down, the widow in black would rise, and France would soon learn how a woman scorned could become the most feared figure in Europe. The summer of 1559 began with celebration. Paris swelled with excitement. The royal tournament promised days of glory, and King Henri II rode into the lists, dressed in golden armor that caught the light like a flame. The stands shook with the roar of thousands. Banners snapped in the wind, and music swelled as if the kingdom itself was singing his name. From her seat in the royal gallery, Catherine sat motionless, her fingers laced tightly, her gaze fixed on her husband. To the crowd, it was a festival of strength. To her, it was a stage trembling with danger. She felt dread coil inside her as the trumpet blared and two horses thundered down the field. Hooves struck the earth, lances lowered, and then wood exploded in a crack that silenced the song of Paris. For a moment, Henri still sat tall in the saddle, sunlight pouring across his breastplate. Then Catherine saw the splintered lance embedded beneath the visor of his helmet. Driving deep into his face, blood spilled down like a crimson ribbon against gold. The crowd gasped as one. Their cheers strangled into silence. Henri reeled, his body collapsing into the arms of attendants rushing to his side. Catherine did not cry out, her eyes fixed on the broken shaft that still quivered in his helmet. The moment froze. Her humiliation as wife ended here. Her reign as widow had begun. Days passed in a haze of agony. Henri lingered between life and death, slipping into delirium, whispering words Catherine could not bear to hear. Diane de Poitiers, the mistress who had ruled his heart, was banished from his chamber. Her jewels were seized, her influence shattered. Catherine remained at his side, veiled, silent, unyielding. When he finally exhaled his last breath, Paris mourned the king, but it was the queen who rose from the ashes. She dressed in black and never abandoned it again. The gown of mourning became her crown. From that day, she was no longer the girl mocked for her barrenness or the wife eclipsed by another. She walked the corridors of the Louvre as a shadow that commanded obedience. Her steps echoed across marble. Her veils drifted like wings of night. Her silence unnerved every noble who dared to meet her gaze. Fear replaced scorn. She had turned grief into armor. Whispers began to bloom like weeds. She gathered perfumers, alchemists, and physicians who mixed herbs and oils in secret chambers. To Catherine, it was healing and art, but to her enemies, it was sorcery. They claimed her rings carried poison, that her perfumes masked venom, that her astrologers summoned omens of death. Children whispered her name with dread. Ambassadors returned to their courts, describing a widow who smelled of roses but carried the stench of fate. Catherine did not silence these rumors. She let them grow. Fear was her shield. Behind the veil of suspicion was a mother desperate to secure her dynasty. Francois, her first son to inherit, was timid and frail. A boy king unfit for the storms of faith that tore France apart. Catherine stood behind him, her voice measured, her patience unshakable, guiding counsels and steadying the throne. When Francois's strength failed and death claimed him, the crown passed to Charles. Another child, another fragile hope. Again, Catherine stepped forward. The convent child had become the widow in black. Her power was no longer hidden. France trembled at her presence. To many, she was no longer a woman, but an omen, a shadow that stretched across the kingdom. Soon, her name would be tied not only to poisons and prophecies, but to the rivers of blood that would one day run through the streets of Paris. The veil did not grow lighter on Catherine's shoulders. It grew heavier with the weight of sons who were born for crowns, yet unready for the storms that came with them. Power no longer felt like triumph. It felt like a house with too many broken windows, and she was the only one inside holding back the wind. Francois took the throne first. He was gentle and quick to tire, a boy whose breath shortened on staircases and whose voice faded in crowded halls. Catherine learned to stand 2 steps behind him and speak when he faltered. She guided counsels with a softness that hid steel. She watched the Guise uncles circle him with smiles that never reached their eyes. In the evenings, she read petitions beside his bed and let him believe the decisions were his. It did not matter who received the praise. What mattered was that the kingdom did not split apart while her child still clung to life. Winter came early for Francois. Fever thinned him. His ring slipped loose on his finger. One night the candles trembled as if the air itself was afraid. Catherine sat so close she could hear the shallow rise and fall of his chest. She did not cry when the breath stopped. She placed her hand over his heart and held it there until the room believed in stillness. Then she rose. The crown would move to another son. A mother does not have time to break when an empire is listening. Charles was still too young to carry such weight. Yet the crown does not wait for age. Catherine took his small hand and walked him into rooms where men fought with words sharper than swords. She trained him to hear the meaning behind the speech. She taught him how to let silence win an argument. For a time, there was a fragile peace. The edicts were written in careful language. The court pretended to breathe as one. Catherine moved through the palace like a seamstress, stitching a seam that refused to hold. Then came the admiral. Gaspard de Coligny returned to court with scars that spoke for him. Charles leaned toward the admiral with the hunger of a boy who wanted to be brave and to be seen. He loved the stories of daring at sea, the maps folded with secret routes, the promise that a king could be a commander in truth and not only a signature on paper. Catherine watched them together and felt the balance tilt. The admiral spoke of honor and new wars. He spoke of alliances that would chain France to dangers across the water. He spoke to the king as if a mother's counsel were a candle to be blown out. Catherine did not slam doors or raise her voice. She changed the tempo of the palace. She filled it with music and masks and dinners that brought enemies into the same light. She met ambassadors until dawn and sent couriers along roads that the admiral did not know. She spoke to bishops and to captains and to men who loved gold more than glory. She kept the peace by giving everyone a reason to wait. Time is a weapon when the hand that holds it never sleeps. Charles grew taller. His jaw sharpened, and his eyes took on a brightness that did not always mean joy. He wanted to prove himself. He wanted to be more than his mother's signature and the admiral's echo. Some nights he paced long corridors with a restlessness that tasted of metal. Other nights he laughed too loudly, then fell silent as if the sound had burned his throat. Catherine stayed close without touching him. A king is a boy you cannot comfort like a child. He must believe he is leading even when you are the one placing stones in front of his feet. Henri, her third son, watched it all. He carried grace like a sword in a velvet sheath. He loved finery and the company of chosen friends who mirrored his brilliance back at him. The court praised his elegance and gossiped about his pleasures. Catherine saw both the charm and the danger. Nobles who feel mocked become enemies. Armies do not follow peacocks for long. She pushed Henri toward command and away from theater. He obeyed the way a prince obeys when he is adored. He did not forget the mirror. The country itself felt like a held breath. Markets opened and closed with the rhythm of rumor. Churches rang with hymns that sounded like threats. Soldiers leaned on spears outside city gates, while their captains counted the miles to trouble. Catherine measured every day like a physician measuring out drops of medicine. Too much pressure and the patient dies. Too little and the sickness returns. In this tightrope season, she searched for a gesture that could teach a wounded realm to love its own reflection again. She found it in a marriage. Her daughter Marguerite would wed Henri of Navarre, Catholic and Protestant, united beneath the same canopy. The plan gleamed like a bridge thrown across a ravine. Catherine knew bridges in France have a way of swaying when the wind rises. She built it anyway. A mother must sometimes place her family at the center of hope in order to hold back despair. On the night before the celebrations, the city seemed to glow. Lanterns swung above streets that smelled of bread and summer dust. Musicians tuned strings. Noblemen arrived with smiles that hid inventories of grudges. Behind shuttered windows, the cautious sharpened knives they swore not to use. Catherine stood at a window of the Louvre and watched torches drift like stars fallen to earth. She closed her eyes and told herself that morning would come with music and not with screams. The crown had moved from sun to sun and had not yet found a head that could wear it without trembling. The mother who carried them all had spun a wedding out of fear and faith and calculation. The city inhaled. The next breath would belong to history. The wedding of Marguerite de Valois and Henri of Navarre had been staged as a bridge over a chasm. Catholics and Protestants stood side by side in Paris, forced into smiles, their hands clasped in uneasy greetings. Catherine had woven this marriage as a fragile thread of peace, yet she knew threads can snap in a single night. The city glittered with torches and music, but beneath the feasts lurked eyes that burned with suspicion. Days later, the air cracked with gunfire. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the towering leader of the Huguenots, was struck by an assassin's shot as he returned to his lodging. He lived, but his blood on the stones of Paris became a signal. Protestants muttered that vengeance must come. Catholics whispered that the admiral would soon master the king. Inside the Louvre, word reached Catherine. She listened, her face still, her thoughts unreadable. To her, the wedding canopy had collapsed, and France stood exposed. That evening, the council gathered in the palace. The young King Charles paced in terror, his words tumbling into cries, his fear filling the chamber. Nobles clashed in heated voices, some calling for arrests, others pleading for caution. Catherine remained in her chair, hands folded, her silence weighing heavier than their shouts. When at last her eyes lifted, the room quieted. She spoke in measured tones that carried through the smoke of candles. The kingdom must act before the kingdom was destroyed. The decision hung in the air like a blade. By midnight, the course was set. The bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois tolled in the early hours of August 24th. That sound did not summon prayer. It summoned knives. Doors burst open. Soldiers rushed through alleys, torches flaring against the dark. Screams shattered the night as neighbors turned on neighbors. Coligny, wounded and helpless, was dragged to a window and hurled into the courtyard below. His body struck the stones as the crowd roared. With that fall, Paris erupted. Blood ran in the gutters. Bodies choked the streets. Mobs hunted through houses, dragging families from beds. The Seine carried the dead as if it were a second procession, a funeral for thousands who had danced at a wedding only days before. The city of light became a furnace of vengeance. From within the palace, Catherine watched the flames rise. Witnesses swore she gave no order, yet none doubted her presence in the decision. She stood behind shuttered windows, her face pale, the glow of fire trembling across her eyes. To some, she appeared as a mourner, to others as a judge. Silence clung to her like a second veil. By dawn, the massacre was no longer rumor. It was history. The streets stank of smoke and iron. Bells that had once tolled for joy now rang over a city soaked in blood. Across Europe, the event would be named with horror: the night of St. Bartholomew's Day. To Catherine, it was the night when the fragile dynasty of her sons was bound to survival through terror. To her enemies, it was the proof that the widow in black was not only guardian of crowns, but the architect of slaughter. The smoke of St. Bartholomew's Day did not vanish with the morning sun. It clung to Paris for years, and it clung even tighter to Catherine. The massacre had secured her dynasty for a moment, yet it had branded her name in a way no coronation ever could. From that night forward, she was no longer spoken of as a queen who preserved the crown. She was remembered as the woman whose silence had drowned a city in blood. Europe shuddered. Messengers galloped to Madrid, Rome, and London. Some courts celebrated, others recoiled in horror. Plays, pamphlets, and sermons painted Catherine as the Black Widow whose hands dripped with the blood of Protestants. Her image grew monstrous. In one tale, she wore a ring that killed with a touch. In another, she mixed potions in secret chambers to bend kings to her will. The truth of her decisions was blurred, yet the legend spread wider than any edict she had ever signed. Within France, the throne she had fought to defend slipped deeper into decay. Charles did not survive long after the massacre. His mind broke beneath the weight of guilt, and his body followed. Henri, her last surviving son, wore the crown next. But the kingdom no longer trusted Valois promises. Factions tore at one another, and assassins lurked in every shadow. Catherine rode tirelessly from city to city, her body frail, her health failing. But still she fought to hold the realm together with treaties and threats. Each journey drained her, yet she refused to stop. To the people who glimpsed her veiled figure passing in the rain, she looked less like a queen than a ghost haunting her own kingdom. By the time death came to her in 1589, she was exhausted. She died at Blois, her chambers quiet, her children gone, her lineage crumbling. She asked for peace, but even in death it was denied. Civil war soon consumed France, and her body was left unburied until the chaos eased. Years later, when revolution shook the land, her resting place was violated, her bones scattered with those of other kings and queens. The silence of the tomb did not protect her. Yet Catherine did not vanish into dust. Her legacy outlived stone and bone. She became a story whispered by mothers to frighten children, a figure painted in sermons as the very shape of wickedness, a queen remembered more for rivers of blood than for decades of survival. History turned her patience into cunning, her grief into cruelty, her intelligence into witchcraft. She became the Black Queen of France, a woman who had endured childhood captivity, a loveless marriage, and the betrayal of her own court, only to stand accused of every shadow that fell upon her dynasty. Her life asks a question that still unsettles. Was she the monster that rumor carved? Or was she a mother who sacrificed mercy in order to keep crowns upon the heads of her sons? The answer lies buried beneath centuries of fear and fascination. As the bells toll in memory of her, one truth remains. Catherine de Medici has never been forgotten. Her story is the story of a woman who rose from orphan to queen, who wore black until the end, and who left behind a legend that still chills the corridors of history. If you wish to keep walking deeper into the hidden rooms of the past, where kings and queens paid for power with their blood, then stay with us. Like, share, and subscribe. Here, the shadows of history will never be silent.